Daily Bible Time, Dominic Steele on a Friday morning, and today we're talking slaves and masters. And last year in Washington, I went to the Museum of African American History, and it was actually just awful hearing the terrible way that African American slaves were treated in that country. But when the Bible speaks about slavery, it's not endorsing that system, that wicked, barbaric system. The Bible is speaking, when it speaks of slaves and masters, into a totally different context. Paul in Colossians is not giving his pro or con statement on slavery here. He's recognizing that slavery is part of the social fabric of the Roman society that he's writing into, and he's trying to help Christians work out how to live in the society that they're in, how to live for the Lord, how to have freedom in Christ, and yet still, as is necessary in the cultural context they're in the first century, live in slavery to a master or treat rightly those under you. I remember a few years ago when Australia was involved in the war in Iraq, and the Labor Party and its then leader Simon Crean, and Mr Crean and Labor were clearly opposed to Australia being in war in that war, and yet given the Australian troops had fought in the war, when they returned, Mr Crean spoke at their welcome home. See, there's one place for him to have a disagreement with the then Prime Minister John Howard about whether or not the troops should have gone, but given they have gone, how do you react to those who'd gone and fought for Australia? And that's really what the Apostle Paul is about. Given that slavery is in the ancient world, how should a slave live? And if you are in slavery, how do you go about being a slave and yet be free in Christ? So let me read the verses. Colossians 3, verse 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you to win their favour, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you'll receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It's the Lord Christ that you're serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, and there's no favouritism. Now, the motivation, again, is there is an inheritance, for it is the Lord Christ you're serving. Slaves, they actually couldn't inherit property on earth, but they're told, be godly in your present situation, because there is an inheritance for you in heaven. What is godliness if you're a slave? Well, it's obeying your master in everything. And again, the assumption here is that the Christian slave is slave to a Christian master, and that the commands of the master will be consistent with Christ's commands, and that obeying them will lead to godliness. And so in that context, the Christian slave is to act, not acting out of compulsive necessity, but with a sincere heart, with wholehearted service, and not dishonesty, not with the dishonest attitude of I work when the boss is watching and I don't work when the boss is not watching. Now, the application here is to people in that slave-master relationship, but there's a clear principle being taught that you could apply just as well to a employer-employee relationship in our context today. And so I've been thinking about how it applies in the workplace I'm in. There's a number of people who I employ. Now, do I, as their employer, feel like I need to watch them, to watch every moment? No. I'm assuming, and I'm confident, that they're acting with sincerity of heart, working at it with all their heart, doing it not only when I'm watching, but also when I'm not watching. And every one of us, we're actually employees in one sense or another. And so there is a challenge for us. How are we going about that? Are we living rightly in that space? Now, what about masters? Colossians 4, chapter 1. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. Or the word is actually Lord. Lords, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know you have a Lord in heaven. The master's told to give his slaves what is right and fair. That means when you're an employer and you're in a position of paying staff, then you're to pay them fairly, an honest pay, an even-handed pay, impartial treatment. Now there's a word to Christian employers or the church council. You mustn't squeeze every last drop out of the employee, but rather to pay fairly, honestly. And if you're in the situation where you have staff reporting to you, you must make sure you deal with them fairly and honestly. one of my friends a few years ago became chief of staff of the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper, Christian man. He decided to try and apply these principles in the way he organised the newspaper, and it was actually a revolution in that organisation. And when he was farewelled, he was paid tribute as the best chief of staff the organisation had ever had. And actually, he was the first chief of staff that organisation had had who hadn't been hated by everyone below him. And what he'd done was see that he had a motivation, that God was watching, that he had a master in heaven, and therefore he was to treat those who were below him, under him, fairly. Thanks so much for being with us on Daily Bible Time this Friday morning, and I'll look forward to seeing you, being with you at church, Village Church, this Sunday, 9:30 in the morning or 6 p.m, either in person or online.